Student of Indic orthopraxy, philosophy, and keen on demographic studies. As a believer in constitutional processes to arrive at solutions for the problems undermining Indic communities at large, Sri Ravilochanan is the managing trustee of People for Dharma and a member of.
The first example that I'm going to give in relation to the lands being taken over by government also relates to the property of Padmanabha Swami himself. But before I go to facts and figures, let me give a brief history of how the temples were managed in this part of the country, especially Kerala. Now, the Kerala Tantra system, which was given by Bhagavan Parashurama to the Taranallur family and through them to 12 other families, as it is believed by the Hindus, mentioned in the scriptures like Kerala Mahatmyam. It is all encompassing with respect to how a temple has to be set up and managed. When the Yajamana builds a temple, he has to allocate enough resources so that the temple can function independently forever. It will never be fiscally dependent on anyone else. So whenever a temple was built in Kerala, it was enjoined upon the builder of the temple that he allocates enough land to the temple so that the income from the land will be more than sufficient to cover all the expenses of the temple and moreover even serve the society in different ways. So there was not a single temple in Kerala which required even 1 paisa or 1 chakram, if you go to the earlier era, of money from the public for the temple to function. They were completely independent. They were powerful enough that sometimes when the temples fell in the hands of wrong administrators, of course things may go awry, but that is why they had different checks and balances to keep things run smoothly. There was not a single case in Kerala where the temples were thoroughly destroyed when they were in the hands of the devotees, the Yajamanas. The Yajamana here are called Uralans. The Uralans are the original trustees of the temple. They are the people who normally set up the temple, descendants of those people. Or in cases where a community has come together to build a temple, then the community nominates these Uralans. Now what has happened is, since 19th century, temples have been losing lands in Kerala through different ways. In Cochin and Travancore, when they were sort of forced to submit to the British Empire, post the failed revolt by Veluthambi Talava, Munro, who became the Diwan as well as British resident, he sort of nationalized the temples. The reason was, the British had imposed huge amounts of what you call as ransom money. I won't call it a subsidiary payment as the British like to call it. Ransom money was demanded from these kingdoms every year, and the Hindu kingdoms were not known to tax people very badly. Where the Mughals have taxed up to 50% of the total land revenue, where the British have even crossed 75% in places. The traditional Hindu system of tax states that a king does not have right to more than 1/6 of the produce. So the highest tax rate is 16.67%. And the British wanted 8 lakh rupees per annum from Travancore. The temples were the biggest landowners, and together they created a revenue of 4 lakh rupees. So you can assume what the quantum of amount that the British wanted to loot from this land. The treasury was not enough to meet their greed. So Munro, who was also the Diwan, he claims, like the current governments do, that the temples are being mismanaged. So the government will manage them better. The temples were taken over. The income from these lands in Travancore was about 4 lakh rupees in 1812 or 13. The expenses were about 2.5 lakhs. So 1.5 lakh rupees surplus goes to the treasury and from there to the British. Now the interesting point is, these lands were taken over and they were treated as akin to government lands. So the government sort of charged only that amount which they would normally collect as land revenue from those lands. Whereas the temples were actually owners of those lands. So they had a right to rent from the land. Please keep this in mind. So these 4 lakh rupees were not what the temple actually lost. They were capable of raising an even higher fund if required. For example, Padmanabha Swami temple, let me come to the examples now. Now, Padmanabha Swami temple thankfully remained outside government control even till 1970s. Even their lands were outside government control. That was one thing where the Travancore royals put their foot down and they stated that we will not allow you to nationalize this land at any cost. That you can do it only over a death. So the temple was left aside. The Sri Pandaravaka lands remained as such, about 11 to 13,000 acres in the state of Kerala, and in the Kanyakumari district another 20,000 acres. So Padmanabha Swami temple's Sri Pandaravaka lands, if you look at the average rate of rent, it was hardly 30 to 40 kgs of paddy per acre. The actual capacity to earn from an acre of paddy field as rent would be easily 6 to 8 times that, and if they are good lands, which especially the Nanjil Nadu lands were in Kanyakumari, you can easily earn even 500 to 600 kgs of paddy per acre. So what this actually means? It means that the temples had enough resources that they could multiply the income if required. The temples lost not only the income which they were earning at that time, but also the chance to earn a higher income in future. So why were these lands given to the temple? They knew that land is a limited resource. Its value increases year by year. It can give a higher rent year by year. Even if the population increases, the rent from the land can cover it. Mere FD interest will never cover it. Our ancestors were brilliant enough to understand this. So they made provisions such that the community and the temples can survive in the long run. This is our seed capital, which we lost. So what happened post the British takeover in Cochin and Travancore? Both had different histories, different trajectories. In Travancore, the temple lands were mixed with government lands even in records. So much so that even by 1860s, people were not able to identify what were exactly Devaswam lands, what were exactly Pandaravaka lands, the former being temple lands, the later being government lands. So it so happened that year by year we see in the budget documents, the income from the temple lands were going down. There were clamor being raised by sections of society, which was even talked about by the British residents, that the government is spending too much on temples. So by 1907 to 1912, the Maharaja at that time, he tried to set things right. He tried to bring back the records to the proper form, and it was seen that it was not possible. The records were non-existent in certain places, destroyed in certain other places, missing in some places, found in some places, which were given back to the temples, but then the king decided that this is not the way to go about it. So by 1922, they passed a resolution, which was perhaps not a bad thing. The resolution was this. The proclamation stated that all the temple lands are henceforth becoming government lands. But at the same time, they made a proper calculation on what would be the current income had 4 lakh earning lands in 1811 remained with the temples on 1922 or in 1922. And they arrived at a figure which was anywhere between 36 to 50 lakhs per annum. So the Maharaja decides that he will in turn take over these lands, which were at that time giving perhaps the temple lands were giving a rent of less than 6-7 lakhs per annum, because the rest have become government lands. And in turn, the government will pay annual payment in lieu of the rent which the temples lost. This is the origin of the term annuity, that is being paid, or the payment annuity that is being paid to the temples in lieu of land rent. Now, in the pre-independence era, such large decisions could not be taken by the Maharaja himself. He has to take the consent of his overlord, in a way, the British, who were ruling India, directly and indirectly. So he had to send a letter to the governor of Madras, get his approval for budget. The final approval they got was 16 lakh rupees per annum. But thankfully, the temple expenses in Travancore kingdom at that time was less than 16 lakhs. And at that time, 16 lakhs was about 40% of the land revenue of the state. So the Maharaja issues in his proclamation very clearly that it has to be 40% of the land revenue or 16 lakh rupees, whichever is higher. And being the dharmic man that he was, he mentions very clearly that the temples were capable of running independently had these lands not been taken from them, and hence the government is liable to maintain and provide for this temple for eternity. It is a liability on the princely state of Travancore. So this payment continuously was made every year. Even till the 1930s, we see that the entire temple expenditure of the princely estate of Travancore, which we today call as Travancore Devaswam Board, in those days was the Devaswam department of the government, was less than this amount which was transferred to them. When the Second World War came, the inflation became higher. This amount was not enough, but they had built some reserves from the previous year's surpluses, which they managed to use. When the British hold over the Indian subcontinent started to loosen, the Maharaja used the time to, Kshetrayanam Maharaja was the ruler at the time, he used the time to immediately increase it to 25 lakhs at first and then to 50 lakhs per annum. 50 lakhs being what was considered as the amount which the government may be liable to pay in 1922. So he thought we should at least pay that much amount when he got some freedom. So this was the status in Travancore when the covenant was signed for the merger of the Tirukochi state with the Union of India. It was clearly mentioned in the covenant that the government is liable to pay 50 lakh rupee per annum to the Devaswam board. Where does this liability come from? From the fact that the temple lands were subsumed by the government or consumed by the government. So then the Kanyakumari split happened. In 1956, this 50 lakh rupees was increased to 60 lakhs in total, 13.5 lakhs to Kanyakumari Devaswam Board, 46.5 lakhs to Travancore Devaswam Board. You know what the amount being paid right now is? I mean, so much of inflation from 1956 to now. It is 1 crore rupees per annum, that's it. Where 50 lakhs was enough for all the temples in Travancore at that time, 1 crore rupee might not be enough even for a single temple now. And we have to keep in mind that we are talking about lakhs of acres of land which were assumed by the government. And much of those lands might have even become urban lands now. Had they remained with the temples would be enormously rich. The basic thing that the Kerala government owes to the temples of Travancore Devaswam Board is that the entire expenditure of the Devaswam Board has to be borne by the government. What the devotees offer in the temple is over and above that. If the Devaswam Board is currently earning an income of say 500 to 600 crores per annum, that amount is entirely money donated by the public. Ideally, that money could have been actually spent on the Hindu community. Because the temples were not dependent on that money, the government is liable to run the temples because they have taken over the lands. That is not happening. The Hindus have lost what they had, the community property, in the name of their deities, which could have supported them. The amount of Annadanam that happened in Travancore was tremendous. How many people know that Padmanabhaswamy Kshetram used to cook about 99,000 para every year, which was of course given in Annadana. In Suchindram it was 80,000 paras. Now for those who don't know, one para is equal to 10 kgs, roughly. This was the amount of bounty that was being spread through the temples to the community. The community lost it. The vultures can sweep in now. And of course they swept in. What happened next? We lost these lands, we lost these incomes, we lost the support from the temples. In return, we are forced to support the temples now. Because if we don't support, the temples will disappear. So where there was an independent institution which was capable of supporting itself and then the community, now the financial power has been taken away from the community. Instead, the community is forced to support its own as well as support the institution which supported it earlier. Because without the institution, maybe the community and civilization will never survive. In Cochin, this problem of mixture of lands never happened. Even till 1947, the Devaswam lands were kept separate. Cochin was a very small state, but in that small state, the Devaswam temples, Cochin Devaswam, owned about 55,000 acres of land. Okay, 55,000 acres of land. And Kudal Manikam temple was not a part of the Devaswam department. It was under the control of private individuals, the hereditary institutions. So, what is so important about Kudal Manikam? That temple was the largest landlord in the state of Cochin. So it was definitely more than 55,000, much more than 55,000. Now, when we tried to figure out what was the amount of land owned by Kudal Manikam Devaswam, we were happily told that all the old records were lost in a fire in 1974. How convenient. Malabar, the land which was ravaged by Tipu Sultan. Lots of temples disappeared, so the temple lands also disappeared. But whatever remained was also significant enough. Malabar temples owned 1.5 lakh acres of forest land, taken away by the government without paying a single penny as compensation. That's a different story. But what about the lands owned by Malabar temples? Guruvayur alone owned about 14,000 acres of land. And there were enough large temples in Malabar Devaswam Board, what constitutes the Malabar Devaswam Board today. All of them owned thousands of acres. Now, these lands outside Travancore state, but within the state of Travancore region, but within the state of Kerala, all these temple lands were taken over by the government through various Land Reforms Act. We know about it. So these Land Reforms Act mentions that annuities are to be paid in lieu of rent that the temple lands lost. Once again, you keep in mind that the temples were realizing only a small portion of the rent which they were capable of earning from the lands. it was stated in 1963 that the government might be liable to pay about 50 lakh rupees per annum as compensation if the paddy fields of religious institutions were taken away from them, out of which close to 95% were owed to Hindu temples. Conveniently, the plantations were kept out of Land Reforms Acts. Now, the plantations were normally not owned by temples, but by, let's say, some other religious institutions. So, without stating that we are targeting one particular religious community, they conveniently used a secular scale or a separation of plantations from paddy fields, as though plantations are in moon and paddy fields are in earth. So they have to be treated differently. So this Land Reforms Act, so many lakhs of acres of land have been lost. What is the government allocating per annum as annuity? 1 crore, 1.2 crores, that's it. There are several other land reforms legislations, Kanam, abolition, not just your land reforms. So when you're going to look at all these aspects, there are two things which are clear. One, where the religious communities who have support system from abroad, where they can get sustenance from there to support their institutions. The Hindus don't have such organizations which can support us. Rather, we had our own organizations which could have easily supported us. The temple properties were community properties. We lost them. The Hindus lost their financial power. If it was only about a case of a non-resident from Kerala filing a case, why is it that residents of Kerala have not filed the case? Reason being that perhaps none of us even knew about these facts. We thought, or perhaps our ancestors, the generation previous to us, thought that the government would be responsible, that the British were demons, and now the British have been thrown out, our people will be better. But all we got were brown sahibs. Anyway, I would try to keep it very brief. It's lunchtime as well. I don't want to stop you from lunch after talking about Annadanam. So, one simple figure. Assume that the government is forced to pay compensation only for Travancore Devaswam Board for not paying the proper compensation that they are supposed to pay with the penal interest, which normally the courts order at about 18% per annum. Do you know what the amount would be now? About 70,000 crore rupees. That is the amount that has been looted from us. 70,000 crores. And this is only for Travancore Devaswam Board. There is Cochin, there is Guruvayur, there is Kudalmanikam, there is Malabar. And by losing these lands, we also lost control over the areas. Those who don't own lands don't get a say in the long run. The communists are very fond of saying that the feudal system survived because land ownership was only in the hands of a few people, right? That is why they split it. But now, land ownership is being perhaps denied to the institutions of a particular community. What should I call that? So, the reason we talked about this annuity is that we are taking steps to try to force the government to at least pay the proper annuity every year, if not the arrears, though I would definitely like the arrears. We need those institutions. I need those Hindu hospitals, colleges, schools, dharmashalas. I need those Hindu institutions which can propagate Hinduism, which would have been built very easily with this money. One of the aims of Travancore Devaswam Board is to propagate the faith. Where have they propagated? And let me tell you this, Travancore Devaswam Board spends majority of their income on administrative cost. 32 people administered the Devaswam department when it was with the Maharaja, without computers, using typewriters, papers and pens, while hundreds of people are required now to administer the same Devaswam department with hundreds of computers, with all the modern gadgets. So what is happening? I would appoint people who are close to me in the department, temporary staffs. I would pay them money. Or the government can say that they are giving government jobs through the Devaswam department. So the Hindu money is being used to fund government jobs, basically. The government has to give jobs, they have to show something, so they use this money. And the Devaswam minister will happily say that the government is not taking a single pie from the temple. We are only contributing money to the temple. Oh, you owe us much more than that. You owe us 1,000 times more. You owe us 10,000 times more. And not taking money is wrong as well. Of course, as I said, when you are literally bleeding the temple money by appointing unnecessary administrative people and increasing the administrative costs and not actually spending on the rituals, isn't it true that Purna Traditions Vichikotsavam is celebrated mostly by funds collected from the public? So where does the money which comes to a temple go? What about the money that the government owes to the temple? We have to think about this. Perhaps we have to ask people. We have to ask the government, whoever be in the government. We have to ask the other parties as well. If the opposition really cares about us, let them talk about it. Yes, we don't have the media institution with us right now, but as the clamoring increases, as it keeps on increases, sometime they have to definitely listen to us. And by that time, we will also be building our own institutions. Ask the questions first. Start creating awareness, at least. Otherwise, perhaps we will never know that there was a time when famine happened throughout southern India. Crores died in the 1875 Great Famine. Travancore alone is missing from the list of the huge number of deaths, from the famine affected list. Why so? Two things which happened. I'll stop in 2 minutes, but I just want to keep this on record. Two things happened. One, this Hindu state ensured that Kanjipuras were opened throughout the state. People were assured one-time meal compulsorily. Famine did not affect the state because the rulers had Hindu ethos. Point number two, something which most people don't even talk about these days. Some money was loaned from the Padmanabha Swami temple. Please keep this in mind. It was loaned from the temple. It was not taken away by them. It was loaned from the temple. And then the government repaid it with interest later on. But it was loaned from the temple, and that money was used to buy grains from Burma to feed these people. There are anecdotes from what we call as Nanjil Nadu today, the Kanyakumari district, that when this was done, the ruler at that time stated that though it is a loan, it has been taken from Padmanabha Swami temple, and we are getting grains from that money. And Martanda Varma made a vow that he would not take a single chakram, a single copper coin from the temple for his personal use or the use of their family. So I cannot use the grains now which are being purchased with this money. For 2 whole years, the royal kitchens made only gruel. They did not have sumptuous meal because of the fact that a king was not supposed to enjoy in lavishly when his people were suffering. And even rice for this gruel became a problem when money was taken from the temple. Fervent letters were written to the talukdars of Nanjil Nadu, where in the forest sometimes wild grains grow, asking them to scourge the forest to find those grains and send it to Thiruvananthapuram so that the royal family doesn't starve. This is the level of devotion they had towards the deity. Once again, Hindu ethos come into play. A word given is never broken. As Tulsidas ji says, Pran jaye par vachan na jaye. All these stories have become lost in the pages of history because history is not written by us anymore. So let us propagate it first. Let us learn, let us tell others, let us understand how things worked earlier. Let us force the government to give us our due so that we can build institutions, we can manage our temples better, we can live with true equality at the very least. Thank you, everyone.